Hi there, my name's Victoria O'Donnell. I'm the Director of Research Development and Academic Enhancement for Laureate, and I'm really pleased to be here today to talk to you about research ethics, focusing on the key issues for students in planning and designing your research project. During this session, we're going to share our understanding of the significance of ethics in the student research process, help you to think about the factors that affect risk and identify what these might be in your own research project, to make sure that you can, as a student, articulate the ethical principles that underpin the risk in your project. And we're going to consider some challenging scenarios, some examples that might help you to understand how these kinds of risks manifest in real projects. It's important to remember that ethics is not an exact science. There are areas of ethics about which people disagree, different perspectives can be brought to bear. There are a whole set of guiding principles which are generally agreed upon, but how these manifest in any individual project varies greatly. And so if you have more questions than you do answers about ethics, then that's probably a good thing. And don't be worried about seeking help or advice from your dissertation advisor, your supervisor, or from another member of faculty. So why do we have to go through the ethical review and approval process before we can begin our research? Well, the reason for that is that we have to make sure that the risks involved in any given project have been minimised. So the primary purpose of the ethical review process is to evaluate the risk that's associated with your project. We have to make sure that we are protecting you as the student researcher. The ethical review process also ensures that the rights and the interests of participants or potential participants are protected. The university also has to be protected from any potential legal issue that may arise, and also any potential for reputational damage that may arise as the result of the unethical conduct of a research project. And it's important to remember that if you are a master's research student, then your research should generally be low risk. So the University of Liverpool do not permit master's students to undertake high risk research. So it's important to understand and work with your DA to ensure that the risk that's associated with your project is minimal. There are a number of different ways in which a project could be considered risky, and we're going to talk through these 6 areas briefly in a moment. But just to introduce each one, I'll talk you through what these 6 areas are. So the risk of a project could be associated with the vulnerability of the participants that you're proposing to use. Secondly, the risk could be associated with the topic itself. There could be risk associated with the issue of consent and whether your participants have freely agreed to take part in the project. There are risks associated with confidentiality and anonymity of participants. There may be risks associated with the particular research method that you want to use. And finally, there are risks associated with you as the student researcher. There may be ways in which your project will make you vulnerable or put you in a risky situation or a potentially risky context. So let's talk first of all about participant vulnerability. When you're planning your research project, put yourself in the position of the participant. Who's looking out for their rights and making sure that they are protected and not exploited or taken advantage of? We as researchers have a role and a responsibility to make sure that we protect the interests of participants. And when it comes to the ethical review of your project proposal, you may find that the reviewers raise questions about whether your participants are being appropriately protected. So if you can think about these things in the design of your project rather than at the end, then you will go a long way to reducing this potential risk. When we talk about participants being vulnerable or potentially vulnerable, This is not just an issue of whether or not they can give consent. There are certain populations who may always be considered vulnerable, for example, children, because a child is not legally able to consent. So when it comes to child populations, we have to make sure that we have consent from their parents who are legally able to give consent on their behalf. But other populations may be vulnerable, not because of some permanent state like being a child, but due to the context that they're in, the circumstances that they're in, the state that they find themselves in. They may be vulnerable because of a life event that has just happened to them, because of some change or transition or instability that they're going through, some circumstance. So we have to consider the various ways in which a participant might be considered vulnerable or potentially vulnerable. One of the ways in which a participant may be vulnerable could be because of the power relationship that they have with the researcher. So if you as a student, for example, are in a position of power or authority over your potential participants, this may make them considered to be a vulnerable population. Examples of these are when the researcher is also a teacher of the students that they are proposing to be participants in the research. It may be if the student is a doctor and the participants could be their patients. It could be because the researcher is a manager in an organisation where the participants are employees or subordinates. So there are lots of different ways in which an individual may be vulnerable or considered vulnerable in the context of a research project, even though in their everyday life we may not consider them to be a particularly vulnerable individual in the way that we would normally use the word vulnerable. Now let's consider how the topic might make a project high risk. The topic could make the project high risk if the topic is sensitive or could potentially be considered to be embarrassing. If the topic has the potential to cause stress or anxiety, then it might be considered risky. If your exploration of this topic could potentially lead participants to disclose their engagement in criminal activity or to disclose abuse, then that makes that topic high risk. There are certain situations in which the topic itself, when considered in isolation, might not be considered risky, but when coupled with the particular participant group that you propose to use, the topic then becomes more risky. So, for example, your topic may be individual people's perceptions of the quality of their local medical care. That in itself might not be considered a risky topic to investigate. However, if your participants are people who have recently been bereaved, who've lost family members, partners, or friends as a result of medical negligence, then that topic may become risky because for that particular group of people, this topic has the potential to cause stress or anxiety. The topic itself may not have the potential to cause stress or anxiety to the population at large, to the general population of the world, but to this particular subgroup of people, that topic may be considered risky. So it is important to think about your topic and your participant group in combination in order to be to give an accurate evaluation of the potential risk. It's also really important to evaluate the information provided to participants. So in any project where people are going to take part in your research, we provide them with participant information. And the participant information should be absolutely clear about what will be involved, what the topic will be, what kinds of questions will be asked, what kinds of information the participant will be expected to give. And that might mean that some people will be put off and will choose not to participate. But it is important, in order to minimize the risk to participants, that we are completely honest and give a holistic and clear picture of exactly what the topic will be, and don't leave anything out, mislead, or give a partial picture of the topic. Another way in which a project might be considered risky is if consent is not given in the correct way. So first of all, it's important to be clear that in any project, your participants must give their consent. They must agree to take part. And that consent must be fully informed. So the information that you've given your participants must give a clear and accurate picture of exactly what the project is about and what will be involved for them. If they're not fully informed, then they haven't given informed consent. If they agree to take part without really understanding what will be involved because we haven't given them the complete picture, then that consent cannot be considered fully informed. The consent must also be voluntary. So we need to make sure that we're evaluating any potential risk of coercion. Are these potential participants being pressured in any way, directly or indirectly? Indirect coercion may be the result of a power relationship. So for example, if you are the researcher and your participants are your employees or your subordinates, then there's the potential that they might feel that they have to take part, otherwise their employment could be negatively impacted. So consent must be completely voluntary, and we have to be honest about any potential links to vulnerability that might come about through these kinds of power factors. And finally, when it comes to consent, even after someone has agreed to take part, we should ensure that they have the opportunity to change their mind. They should be able to withdraw. And as a researcher, you then have to think about the practicalities of that. If someone decides at some point in your project that they've changed their mind and they want their data that they've given to you before to be withdrawn from the study, how are you going to achieve that? How will you, on a practical level, be able to extract that individual person's data from the entire set that you have and remove it without any penalty to that individual? And so again, we have to make sure that we evaluate the information that's given to participants in advance so that they are aware of their ability to withdraw, and they are also aware of any constraints or restrictions upon when and how their withdrawal will be permitted. The fourth area of risk to think about as you design your project is associated with confidentiality and anonymity. And to minimize this risk, we have to think about how we will protect our participants' identities, make sure that they won't be named, make sure that they won't be, that their organizations won't be named or identifiable. And sometimes there's a risk of identification by deduction. So if your participant population is quite a small one, then it may be that with very little information given, somebody could work out who those participants are. So we have to make sure that we have ways of keeping the data confidential, and we have ways of ensuring that participation is anonymous, that no one will know whether they did or did not take part. We can think now about how the particular research method that you choose could be considered risky. Evaluate whether there's likely to be any risk of pain or harm to your participants, and that could be psychological as well as physical. If this is likely to cause stress or anxiety, then that would be considered psychological harm. Does your project propose to use drugs, any other substances, or invasive or intrusive procedures? Think about the time commitment. Even if you're doing something non-invasive, like an interview or a focus group, or asking them to complete a questionnaire, how long will that take? And does it really have to be that long? Are the questions that you're asking appropriately worded, and has the questionnaire or the interview schedule been designed to minimize the amount of time that somebody is expected to spend on your research? Make sure that the time commitment is not unnecessarily prolonged. And then your method must also make sure that you're not deceiving or misleading your participants in any way, that it doesn't involve any misdirection or concealment of the true purpose of the project or exactly what will happen to them. And the sixth and final area of potential risk is about your own vulnerability as the researcher. Think about whether there's likely to be any physical risk to you due to the context or the location in which your research is taking place. Will you be physically safe? Is there any potential psychological risk to you as the researcher? Could the topic itself or your engagement with the participants on this topic cause you any stress or anxiety or embarrassment? Is there any risk of a potential conflict of interest? Could you, by doing this research, put yourself at risk, for example, of being fired or running into difficulties with your employer or some other government agency? Evaluate the risk of vulnerability due to power relationships. So if you are the researcher and your research is with your senior managers, could that put you in a position of risk in the same way as your subordinates could be at risk if they were your participants? So now we're going to talk about the 6 underpinning principles that guide research ethics globally. The concrete operational manifestation of these principles will differ from project to project, but overall, these 6 principles are agreed upon by research agencies and ethics organisations around the world. And the first of these is beneficence, and that is the principle of doing good. So every research project should have a purpose, and the intention should be to contribute something to the world around us, to contribute to knowledge or to practice, but there should be a purpose which ensures that it can make some contribution. And as a result of this principle, the ethical approval process will evaluate the integrity and the quality of your research project. If your research is poorly designed or is unlikely to lead to findings which are actually going to be useful, then this principle would be undermined. The second principle here then is maleficence, and that is the principle of avoiding harm. So we should seek to avoid harm, minimize any sort of harm that we do to our participants, to the communities, and to the researcher themselves. The third principle, which we've explored in some detail already, is that of fully informed consent. The fourth principle is of voluntary participation by participants. The fifth principle is of confidentiality of data and anonymity in participation. And the final principle is of independence and impartiality. So the researcher should not be driven by another agenda. The research itself should seek to find the truth and not be influenced by external factors or conflicts of interest. And now we can think about some additional ethical considerations. In addition to these guiding principles, we also have to think about the culture and the context in which the research will take place. There are local values governing research and practice. There are national laws and guidelines that have to be taken into account. And for this reason, the University of Liverpool require anyone who's conducting research outside of the UK to ensure that they obtain local ethical approval from the site of the research itself, as well as through the university. And that's because the University of Liverpool cannot possibly know all of the potential countries and contexts in which research by its students might be taking place, nor the values, the cultural context, the national laws, the local laws, the ethical guidelines that exist in all of those potential locations. So it's important that you seek out a local ethical committee first. Now, it may be that in the particular research that you're doing, that there isn't a local relevant ethics committee. If you're doing your research for a government agency, or if you're doing your research in a school, a hospital, a university, a college, for an NGO, they're all likely to have their own ethical committees, but it may be that you discover that they don't. But the onus is on the student researcher to seek out a local ethics committee and obtain local ethical approval first. It's also important as the researcher that you ensure that you have the appropriate permission from any stakeholders or gatekeepers to your participants. So if you're identifying participants through an organisation, through a school, through a hospital, through an NGO, then you must make sure that you have permission from the gatekeepers to that organisation before you can approach those participants. And the letter of permission will be required as part of your ethics application ultimately. On the next slide, I'm going to go through some scenarios that you can have a think about that might provoke some of your thinking in this area a little bit further. What I'd like you to do is identify, if you can, and evaluate the potential risks that might be applicable to each scenario. Think of ways that might mitigate those risks, and then consider how the proposal could be modified to reduce the risk in each case. Imagine a scenario in which a student researcher wants to evaluate the quality of emergency healthcare provision, and they want to do this by distributing questionnaires to family members of accident victims in the emergency room when they've been brought in. What do you think the potential risks are here? And how could you mitigate those risks to reduce the risk associated with this kind of project? In this next scenario, imagine you have a participant who requests that their data be withdrawn, but the research method used has been focus groups. Those focus groups each have a number of people in them, and they were audio recorded only. This makes it difficult to know who was speaking at any given time. How could you go about withdrawing that participant's data? And if you don't think this is possible, what could you do to redesign this project in order to reduce the risk associated with the challenge to withdrawal of data by a participant? Imagine another scenario in which a school principal agrees to give a researcher permission, to grant them a letter of permission to access their school in order to conduct research with the teachers. But the school principal agrees to do this only on condition that the data the researcher collects is shared with her. What do you think the risks are if research is conducted within the school when that data will ultimately be shared with the school principal? And what could we do to minimise or reduce this risk? And finally, think about this proposal. A student researcher wants to explore the experiences of female employees. But the employees are part of a very male-dominated workforce within a small local company. There are very few female employees in that organisation, and the organisation itself is a very small one in a local community. What are the risks there, do you think? What would you do to minimise those risks? And so as we approach the end of this webinar, what are the things that we as student researchers should be doing in order to think about and build ethical principles and practices into our research proposal and project? Well, first of all, we should be discussing risks and their ethical implications with our dissertation advisors or our supervisors right from the beginning of the research process. We should be working with faculty to develop a proposal that mitigates risks, that minimises the risks inherent in the project. And we should be working throughout the project planning and design process to reduce these risks. Don't leave it until the end to think about the risks associated with the project you're planning. Ensure that the ethical approval process is the end point of a process of building ethics into your research design. It shouldn't be a starting point for addressing ethical concerns. If you've only begun thinking about ethics at the point when you're submitting your application for ethical approval, then that's too late. It should begin much earlier in the process. And seek advice early on if we're at all unsure about any aspect of our research. There are lots of people around who can help. Your supervisor or dissertation advisor should be your first port of call, but they can refer any query to the programme Virtual Research Ethics Committee. And there's also the Liverpool Online Research Ethics Committee, from which advice and guidance can be sought at any time. Thank you for listening, and I hope this has been useful.